There is a deep-seated conflict between capitalism and the open society. I want to start with that rather striking quotation from George Soros's extremely rich and provocative talk to let those words reverberate once again through the hall in their clarity, but also in their radicalism. We're standing here in Budapest almost precisely 20 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I remember vividly that time 20 years ago when the talk in the United States was not only about the inevitability of capitalism and democracy, because those two go obviously hand in hand, but the assumption and the argument that the combination of those two systems, if you will, political and economic, constituted the end of history, to use the title of the famous essay by Francis Fukuyama. Fukuyama was arguing, borrowing ideas from Kojève and Hegel, that the fall of the wall beckoned a new age in which capitalism and democracy, working hand in hand, would essentially take over the world. Well, we know that history didn't end. We know about the Balkans, Rwanda, the Gulf War, the Iraq War. There's been a great deal of history since then, but it is striking to find in this place, expressed by a key figure in world capitalism and world finance, the notion that democracy and the open society are, as they exist today, incompatible. I want to seize on my rights as moderator and reconceive this question a little bit as a reporter as well in terms of power versus the open society. I was reminded, thinking as George spoke, of a time in 1987 when I was covering the Haitian election, which was supposed to bring the transition of democracy to Haiti after a long dictatorship, and turned out to be a bloody disaster in which the people with power confronted the challenge of all of these people standing there ready to vote by sending gunmen to murder them, murdering a couple of hundred of them, as it turned out. I remember thinking at the time that our vision of democracy is, at its heart, a kind of beautiful myth. It proposes that on one sacred day, everyone in the society, the powerless and the powerful, the poor and the wealthy, stand together with exactly the same amount of power. They have the power of one vote. But of course, that day does not change power relations within a society. In Haiti, the powerful pay gunmen wielding Uzis and machetes to go and kill voters. In the United States, the powerful pay lobbyists to lobby Congress, pay ad men to make advertisements, pay political candidates to run their campaigns. Trying to press down power in one place is like pressing down on water in a lake. It rises somewhere else. It seems to me then that the heart of this problem has to do with our conception of the open society, particularly as George has set it out to you today and in the previous lectures, and I want to press him a little bit on this issue. Because the open society we're talking about, which he said is supposed to or exists to promote the public good, in fact was not set up that way. The famous framers of the Constitution, put together a system whose major function was to divide government power, balance it, one part against the other, and to try to clear a private space in which government power could not dominate. A good example is the famous First Amendment. We've heard today about brainwashing, about the manipulation of the public, the use of the press to do that. We all know how this has happened and is happening in the United States. The fact is, though, when we look at the famous First Amendment, what do we find? We find no right to truth. We find no right to enlightenment. We find no right to know, although we hear that phrase used often. The full text of the First Amendment as regards freedom of the press reads as follows: Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press. That is, it is a limitation on government vis-a-vis the press. It says nothing about private forces. And indeed, the press is a collection of private institutions, money-making institutions, that can indeed be manipulated. It also says nothing about restraining private power from influencing politics through elections. So I would say today, and I'd like to ask George about this, doesn't our problem really have to do with renovating our open society as it exists in ways that will conceive of it less as a neutral arbitrator and more of an active power trying to assure what George called the common good? Now, this may sound like a radical proposal. In fact, we've had 100 years of fighting over precisely this issue within the United States. One example, boring as it is campaign finance reform. George said it's rightly said, it's extremely expensive to get elected. Elected officials feel that they owe fealty to those who paid for their campaigns. This is obviously true. But in fact, there's nothing inherently expensive about getting elected. 70% of the cost of running for office is buying television time. The airwaves belong to the public. The government has absolutely the right to require, although it can't limit, according to the Supreme Court, it can't limit what private agents give to candidates. It can require the airwaves, the broadcast and cable networks, to give space for free to candidates. That is something absolutely conceivable, absolutely doable. It can also, when we talk about the press, can not only ensure public access to the airwaves, public broadcasting and so on, it can require a certain degree of truth-telling and fairness. And I say this not as an active proposal, but as a matter of history. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, in his regulation of broadcasting back in the 30s, then radio, but it was inherited by the television industry, imposed a fairness doctrine, which essentially said both sides at least need to be heard. He also imposed a public interest requirement. Each year, the television networks had to make a case to the licensing board that they had served the public interest. This was usually taken to mean that the news divisions of broadcast networks would be protected from the profit motive, which is to say they were loss leaders. They spent a great deal of money, they did it, the networks thought, well, we have to do this to serve the public interest. Now, this was a real thing that actually expired in real time. This is expired under the Reagan administration. So these things could very easily be put back into effect. There are a lot of other obvious proposals we could make in which the open society would become an affirmative supporter of the common good and a countervailing force to market power. Let me say my time is short. Let me just make a couple of brief other points. Well, let me make a final point, which is this. George has suggested that people need to divide their private interests from their political interests. He offers himself as an example, and it's a very vivid one. I would suggest, though, that the proposal that we produce many, many George Soroses and have a kind of truth-telling squad is going to be a very difficult thing to do because he's a very unusual person. I also think that trying to establish a group of truth-tellers compared yesterday to a Platonic idea, that is, we're talking about guardians of the public good who would be trained to observe, to critique, and to lead the public, will not in the end be a practical idea. I think and I will be interested to hear his views of this, what needs to be done is a program of reformation of the original conception of an open society. And many of these proposals are absolutely conceivable, absolutely doable. President Obama has talked about, for example, bringing back the fairness doctrine. There's a great deal of opposition to it. And one should observe that the very forces that you've detailed so well and so richly in your talk militate against the very reforms that I am suggesting. I understand that. Nonetheless, I am optimistic about it. And I would ask you whether we shouldn't really be looking for systemic reform more than private reform. Thank you.
Very good. I think we should go to ask them to comment, and we can go after.
I will indeed.
Okay.
George suggests that we ask the students and faculty at Fudan University in Shanghai to begin with their comments. And so I say hello to our friends in Shanghai and welcome them invite them to ask the first question.
Okay, hello from Fudan University, Shanghai. Thanks a lot for this fascinating lecture. And I'm the local facilitator, and we already have 3 questions, 2 from faculty members and 1 from student. Now I'm handing it over to the first participant.
Oh, maybe, okay. Yeah. Hello, George. I'm Wei-Shen Li from the School of Economics. I meet you this, okay. Just one question. In the conclusion, you said, I believe that if more people separated their role as political participants from their role of market participants, the American democracy will function better. I agree with your standpoint. But I just wonder, one question, that's, if I'm not misunderstanding what you say, if without the representative democracy, or in James Buchanan's jargon, the constitutional democracy, the separation of 2 roles you proposed could be implemented or not. That's, just like China, that 2 roles is closely linked together. That's all the questions of Chinese society face today. That's my question. Thank you.
I believe he asked, you got the question about the separation of 2 worlds?
Yes, it's a very interesting question.
You might restate it for the audience.
For once, I understood it very well. I suggest separating the 2 roles. How should that apply in China, where you don't have a representative democracy? And I think it's a very, very interesting question, and it's much more difficult, I think, to apply it in China, because China is a very efficient system of decision-making, but it is characterized by much greater political influence over economic decisions. Effectively, investment decisions are mainly guided by political considerations rather than by the profit motive. It is in many ways efficient, but the problem then of using personally or making decisions for personal interest rather than the public interest is very great, the temptation. And of course, corruption is the big factor in China that limits the success of the Chinese model. It's really the main problem. And I think that actually moving towards a more open society, and giving the people more rights to stand up and to express their views, and establishing proper channels, establishing the rule of law rather than the rule of men, is the direction in which China needs to go in order to actually improve the efficiency of investment, because it's remarkable how low the rate of return on investment in China is. It's actually quite amazing given China's success. But then more than 50% of the GNP actually goes into investment. But the rate of return on that investment is very low.
Given, if you conceive of private interests having a determining effect on public policy as corruption, if we define it that way, is China more corrupt than the United States?
I would say that corruption is endemic in the system. In the United States, it's really mainly in the political arena that the lobbying and special interests influencing the regulations that are enacted. That's where mainly the distortion comes into play. Whereas in China, it pervades the economic system itself.
Why don't we go to our second question from Fudan University?
Mr. Soros. Now we have the second question.
Hello, this is Yupeng, a student from Fudan University. My question would be, agencies and representatives somehow are made up, and most of the times, of elites. And at the same time, you're suggesting the separation of the roles of participants in the politics and participants in the market would somehow send a negative message to those elites, and which somehow indicated by the history that we're gonna see more catastrophic effects. As predicted, maybe we would see more financial meltdowns in the future. So my question would be, how effective do you think your suggestion, the separation of roles, would play in the future? Thank you.
Could you just repeat the question?
I think it's a question about whether the separation of public and private roles that you suggested would play a distinctly negative role on the elites and would have a negative effect on their functioning as economic agents. That's how he formed the question.
If you separated it, it will have a negative effect?
On elites in playing their role as economic agents of the private sector.
I don't understand the question. It doesn't make sense to me, frankly.
It could be reconceived as, do the elites need market fundamentalism and their influence on the public sector to function profitably and effectively?
They must be motivated by self-interest in order to be making the rules. I don't see that. I think that certainly in a well-functioning democracy, that has not been the case.
Well, let me put it in a different form. If what your vision that you set out was enacted, would we have as one final result a more equal distribution of wealth?
Well, I think that depends on basically on the will of the electorate.
Well, you mentioned the estate tax, which was abolished even though it was absolutely contrary to the interests of 99% of the population. The implication being if people really understood what it involved, abolishing it wouldn't have been abolished.
You are right. Actually, given the influence of market fundamentalism, the success of market fundamentalism in America, which has really kind of skewed public opinion against their own interest. As I quoted the estate tax as a very good example. Certainly, if you eliminated that, then I think the public interest would be better served, and presumably it would lead to a more equal distribution of wealth. But I don't want to prejudge it, because let's say I happen to be in that camp politically that would favor a more equal distribution. But I don't want to impose my judgment and claim that that's how open society has to be. I think that is really up to the people in the democracy concerned to make that decision.
I would press you just a little on that before going back to Fudan, because isn't that a bit of an imposed neutrality? I mean, really what you're saying is that the public interest should be more equitably represented the broader public interest. And I would think that would suggest that the great concentrations of wealth we've seen in recent years would to some extent be reversed. No?
Well, look, again, the evidence points out that the differences in income have tremendously increased in the last 25 years when market fundamentalism has become the dominant creed. And in fact, the average has not benefited. It's really the top 1 or 2% of the population that gathered all the extra revenues that came from a benefit. So and therefore, if you reversed it, presumably it would go the other way. But I still don't think, I just don't want to, I agree with that argument, but I don't want to pose that as sort of the open society,
Yes.
because I would be prejudging it, which is not appropriate.
We'll go back now to Fudan University in Shanghai. Third question.
Okay, thank you very much. And the third question from myself. My name is Pei Sun, Associate Professor in School of Management, Fudan University. I think the title of the lecture is Capitalism versus Open Society. And one of the central messages conveyed from this lecture seems that the rise of market fundamentalism is a major threat to open society. So my question is, what's the relationship between capitalism and market fundamentalism? And put in another way, under what conditions, under what circumstances, the right will, market fundamentalism will develop and even flourish in a capitalist society? Thank you.
Could you repeat that?
Well, I thought he was getting, and I may have misunderstood, to the fact that capitalism doesn't necessarily need democracy as a partner. That is what I understood the beginning of the question meant, that in fact, and he is coming, of course, from Shanghai, one of the most powerful cities in a country that is both vividly capitalist and non-democratic. But I am afraid I didn't understand the very last line of the question. Maybe you could repeat it. I simply didn't understand what you said.
The last line.
Just the last line.
Market fundamentalism may not develop quite fastly in capitalist society because market fundamentalism is not equal to capitalism. So, but you in the lecture you said that in the United States, market fundamentalism even flourish over the last several decades in such a particular capitalist society. So my question is, under what conditions, so under what circumstances, market fundamentalism will develop or flourish in a capitalist society?
Under what situations does market fundamentalism flourish in capitalist societies?
Relationship between capitalism and market fundamentalism, how are they different?
Yes.
Look,
thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. It's a very good question. I don't think that market fundamentalism has served capitalism or even the people who espouse that philosophy or ideology very well. Because, as I tried to argue in my previous lectures, it has been responsible for the super bubble, which burst with tremendous damage to the American economy. I think that, for instance, right now, after the bursting of the bubble, when the financial system is being allowed to earn its way out of a hole, to rebuild its capital through hidden subsidies, by making capital available, financing available from the central bank at zero cost, when you can then invest, the banks can invest it with no risk whatsoever into government bonds, earning 3.5%, and not actually requiring any capital reserves to do that. So they are being effectively given over a hidden subsidy, and at the same time, the banks are now paying very large bonuses to their employees, who are supposed to be generating those earnings by taking risks successfully, in other words, making the right decisions. Here they are just benefiting from a hidden subsidy, and I think it's a big mistake for them actually to use that money in that way, because it generates public resentment. So I think it's a very short-sighted view on the part of the market fundamentalists to persist in putting their private interests ahead of the public interest.
I'd like to thank our participants at Fudan University.
Maybe we can come back later.
Maybe we will come back at the end. We'll throw the questions now open to the floor. And as we reach one, I'm going to ask you one quick question to bridge this, which is the policy that you just identified that the Obama regime has, or the Obama administration, has pursued. Was it the result of too much private interest on public policy? Did they make this decision as a result of the influence of capital, or did they simply not know how to take the other course that you described?
Well, I think there are two elements. One, that they basically judged it was a conscious political decision, because there was this alternative. For simplicity's sake, you may call it the Scandinavian solution and the Japanese solution, because the Scandinavians effectively nationalized their banks temporarily, and they got out of a crisis pretty fast, and of course denationalized the banks, whereas the Japanese supported their banking system through hidden subsidies. And basically the Obama administration decided to go the Japanese route, and that was partly, I think, a conscious decision that politically it would be unacceptable, that in fact this anti-government sentiment and tradition in America is too strong for them to go against it. And secondly, I think it, in a way, there was a certain sequence. The crisis hit, the previous administration took this road of indirect subsidies, and they weren't prepared with the alternative. So continuity dragged them in. So partly it was deliberate, and partly it was just the shortness of time, or time pressure, that led to that.
And partly out of not wanting to oppose the ideological beliefs of the American population.
And of course, Obama wanted to be the great uniter and did not want to sort of impose a start off by being too critical of what went before. And I think that was a mistake, because you have had 25 years of accumulated excess that came home to roost. But by claiming to arrest the decline, he has actually now taken possession.
And there is an argument for doing the heaviest lifting politically at the beginning, when you have the greatest political capital.
Right.
Questions? Sir, over there. Wait for the microphone, please, and tell us your name.
My name is George Kopitz, and I'm a chairman of the Fiscal Council in the Republic of Hungary, and I am also a lecturer at your university, Central European University here in Budapest. First of all, I would like to start by thanking George Soros for an extremely stimulating and thought-provoking presentation. And then thereafter, I would like to just take a little bit of an issue with your observation of the US agency problem through the last 50 years or the last 100 years. There was an observer of the US Senate in the early, I don't remember who it was, Mencken or who it was, who observed that the price of a senator in the US was about $1,000. Of course, it was much more today's prices than what it is today, right? Yeah. But anyway, there was certainly a lot of agency problem in the early part and in the course of I don't think that we are any less moral or less corrupt a society today as at the beginning of the century, but we could go on with that. In any case, you refer to the fact that you need checks and balances, in fact, a lot of institutional framework made up of a lot of watchdogs to watch over the honesty of government. And certainly in the US, there has been a lot of institutions created since that time in the course of even the last 50 years, but going further back, the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, 1975, the Congressional Budget Office, and then, of course, even before the General Accounting Office, which then became the General Accountability Office, all of this to serve precisely the purpose that you have described. In fact, we in Hungary, and myself, I'm heading a very new institution, which is more or less patterned after the Congressional Budget Office, to keep the government honest in fiscal policy. But my question really is looking forward a little bit and drawing from already some of your remarks today and elsewhere in the media. What sort of institutions do you think would really serve the US, and of course we could extend that onto Europe? What sort of institutions would really serve this extremely useful purpose of watching over the financial system? If you could, it's...
What institutions?
What sort of institutions would serve the purpose of watching over the financial institutions?
Yeah. Look, I think that America actually has all the institutions that it needs. It really has a wonderful constitution that, in spite of a few maybe things where it's maybe out of date, like the First Amendment stands in the way of controlling spending on elections and things like that, which the founding fathers couldn't anticipate 200 years in advance. So there are a few things like that. But on the whole, the institutions are really there. It's really the values that I think have gotten skewed and distorted through the triumph of market fundamentalism. And I've pointed out the contradictions, the internal contradictions in those values. So I hold values responsible, not institutions. I think we've got the institutions. We did, in contrast, let's say, to countries in Eastern Europe, which are relatively young, and the institutions are not strong enough.
Questions? Yes, sir? There's the microphone.
After.
I'm Fred Brantman. I'm a writer. I used to work with, excuse me, with folks like Larry Summers and Paul Krugman and so forth, and concluded then, and have seen nothing to change it since, that, and I'm curious what you think of this, that we've entered a phase of late capitalism, high debts, uncompetitive industry, major financial institutions which no longer serve the public interest, which make our previous economic theories that worked in the past irrelevant today, fundamentally, and that America cannot grow as it's grown in the past, and that therefore we really have no choice but to start thinking about accepting that fact, accepting that the real model for America of the future has to be a European-style welfare state if it can't grow as it has in the past, and if it's not going to fall apart into warring camps, that we need to start promoting values of at least voluntary simplicity, if not it's just accepting that we're all going to have to live more simply. We are going to have a major redistribution of wealth and fundamentally change the very image of where we're heading rather than, as I think we are now doing, hoping to recover the past. One last comment on that is I think when you really look at the level of debt that we've taken out and the fact that we simply can't repay it under any conceivable scenario for the next 10 or 20 years without a very robust set of industries that are bringing new wealth into America, which we can't see, and we think of what must be done to solve global warming and to deal with an aging baby boom generation that's going to eat up an increasing amount of, or need an increasing amount of entitlements. I'm wondering what you think of this notion that we really have to stop, close with the past, except we're in a late capitalist phase, and start thinking of totally new solutions to which the old solutions are relevant.
I think we get the idea. Are we in a late capitalist phase that can only be confronted with a European welfare-style system and a major redistribution of wealth?
No, look, that's your view, but it's not necessarily the view in America. And to say that, I mean, you're right in the sense that the European welfare state has actually weathered this storm very well compared to the United States. And while people, particularly in America, used to be very critical of the welfare state and the relatively low rate of growth as measured in GNP, effectively there has been a payoff because the automatic stabilizers have actually really done their job. And hopefully this will influence American opinion looking forward. But as I say, I think you're sort of seeking to impose your views on America, and I don't think that's a practical proposition.
Next question is in the second row here. Can you bring the microphone, please? And then back there. Thank you.
Mr. Soros, in the framework of an open society, how do you analyze Mr. Obama's health program proposition?
How would you analyze President Obama's health proposition, particularly with respect to the prosperity and the problems in the economy?
Well, I've been quite distressed by the debate because unfortunately the health system proposed by Obama really is not designed to provide health. It's designed to pay for procedures, and it encourages then procedures, not preservation or promotion of health. So it's fundamentally flawed. And I have no doubt that what you need is a national health service, a single provider, because only a single provider can be concerned about prevention as distinct from treating disease. But that is a non-starter, as I said in my lecture. This is absolutely national health. Socialism has been outlawed in America. I find that rather distressing.
May I ask a follow-up here? Why, if indeed everyone is insured, And if it's in the interest of health insurance companies, since they can't reject people when they're sick, to have them healthier because they will then spend less money curing them, why cannot the system Obama is now championing also value health?
Because the people can move from one provider to another. So you don't have if you have one provider, then the provider is concerned about having fewer procedures. If you have many providers, you don't have the same situation. So I think, quite apart from the fact also that having the insurance companies compete with each other, the only way they can improve their profits is actually by denying benefits.
Procedures.
So you've got the wrong incentives built into the system.
Okay. Back there?
My name is Julia Varadi, and I'm a journalist, a Hungarian journalist, and if you don't mind, I stay a little bit in this country. Even if we have 20 years of so-called democracy and capitalism, we are beginners, and therefore my question might be naive. But do you think there is anybody, maybe you are the only one, I think, who could convince people who are playing a role in the market not to be influenced by politics, or people who are playing a role in politics not to try to influence the market? I agree with Mr. Danner that George Soros should be multiplied, but until he's not, I doubt that there are too many people who can be convinced about the so-called open society, this phenomenon we are waiting for so much. Thank you.
How do you convince people, given that you can't multiply George Soros, how do you convince people to separate their private interests and their public interests?
Well, by giving a lecture like this.
Is everybody in the room convinced? Is that the answer? Moral suasion. That is.
What else? I mean, hopefully arguments can still convince people.
We hope that is the case. Let's see, gentleman in the front here.
There was the people there.
Yes, and we'll go over to the side next.
Howard Robinson, Central European University, and it's really a follow-up on the last question. You emphasized, as it were, the division within individuals, but a certain kind of Platonism and old-fashioned Toryism also had that a division between certain classes of person. So in Disraeli's Sibyl, for example, you have a civilized commercial society because the aristocracy, the church, and the monarchy don't have direct commercial values. In England, this was passed on through the public schools to the middle class and the professions, and with Keynesianism to the state sector. Is there any way of restoring, not merely hoping people will be schizophrenically honest, but having whole sectors of society who don't, from moment to moment, make all their decisions on commercial basis? Mrs. Thatcher destroyed that in Britain. How can we restore that?
How can we restore parts of society like the church, the aristocracy, that have built into their traditions a societal responsibility divorced from pursuit of gain and pursuit of wealth?
I mean, I don't believe that you can, this trap of idealizing the past. I try to resist it. I can't totally resist it because I see a deterioration in our values. But I think we need to reconstitute it in some new form and not hark back to the past. It was actually, I think, in the case of British democracy, the aristocracy played a very positive role. But that was that particular historic situation. So I think we need to create a new one. And I think it's not impossible.
On this side? Yes, right there.
Ellen Hume from CEU. I wanted to go back to the question that we got from China, which I don't think was fully recognized, which is why is market fundamentalism so powerful in the States? How did it become the current philosophy that's so strong? And could there be circumstances that it might happen, for example, in China as well? How do we look for the hallmarks that create this market fundamentalism that you find so negative?
No, look, I tried to explain in my lecture that the main power of market fundamentalism has been the very well financed propaganda. And in fact, there's been some studies that showed how 7 foundations played a very big role in spreading the market values to areas where they don't belong, as for instance, law and economics. And there's a typical example that was basically introduced by financial support for that approach. So I think that is, in my opinion, why it has been so successful. And I think that this moment, when it has so conspicuously done so much damage because of its instability, is the moment to bring home that it has in fact failed and we have to abandon it.
I think it is worth pointing out that this was, in a sense, a premeditated decision brought about by the Powell memo and certain other things by think tanks to spread this. One should also mention, I think, the high inflation and terrible economic situation at the end of the Carter administration, which led the ground for the acceptance of this sort of radical view of capitalism.
Yeah, well, the inflation of the 70s has had the effect of discrediting Keynesian economics and allowing the monetarist and efficient market hypothesis, etc., to come to the fore.
Yes. Yes, sir. And then we'll go to the back.
I'm Gerd Kasper, a trustee. George, I would like to comment on your last point and really disagree with you to a very large extent. Yes, there were those foundations, Olin and so on, that gave money to universities. But I think that is actually a very misleading understanding of what really happened. And Robert Skidelsky, in a new book that he just published weeks ago, is taking a different take. He is saying it's really the power of ideas. And lots of the ideas we now associate with the Chicago School were very powerful. Many of the participants remained ordinary, relatively poor in genteel poverty, to be sure, but relatively poor academics. That was never the issue. But these ideas seem to have a tremendous attraction because they seem to work for a whole variety of problems, including the assumption of the rational consumer and so on. Now, I happen to agree with most of your criticisms, but I think the notion that it was a kind of conspiracy on the part of wealthy foundations misleads us completely. Yesterday there was reference to the Platonic elites and were you not going back to it? Well, the dismal news is there are elites, there are Platonic elites, and it could be the Chicago School of Economics. And so we could indeed go in totally undesirable directions. And we should forestall that. And since I do have if not the podium, the microphone, I would like to go back to the earlier question about institutions. I do believe what you are doing, this lecture, preaching, as it were, is very important and needs to be done. But in the end, it is only the quality of our institutions and the engagement in these institutions, the journalists who are permanently drumming and saying, hey, you're not doing it right, you are keeping information from us. and so on and so on. That will get us improvements. I think hoping for the day when the ordinary citizen will overcome self-interest and will act only in the public interest, assuming we can define it, the public interest. You yourself are very reluctant, actually, in many areas to define what the public interest is. Only then I would put my trust in those solutions rather than in a big moral reformation, and that, that includes Hungary too.
I will seize the chance to self-interestedly put forward the critiques, because they follow directly from what you said, that I put forward in my remarks, which is, are there not institutions that could be encouraged aggressively to be renovated, in effect, because many of them already exist, that can at least help the moral suasion you're talking about? I'm talking about the fairness doctrine, electoral reform, limitation on campaign spending, public spending on campaigns. A lot of the problems you pointed to do have conceivable solutions beyond persuasion in the moral realm.
No, undoubtedly, there are reforms. Certainly, campaign finance reform is very much needed. But the fact is that every reform has some flaw in it. Mm-hmm. And I was a supporter of campaign finance reform, particular aspects of it and so on. But I also gave a grant to the New York University Brennan Center, and I said I would want you to study the flaws, the potential flaws in the reform proposals. That part of the grant was actually never used. There was, they didn't actually do a very good job. I mean, we have to recognize that all our arrangements are flawed. This is the human condition. And of course, you're right that the Chicago School had a tremendous intellectual power and influence. But you see, a school of thought which basically said that government is bad actually leads to bad government. So there is this reflexive connection as well. In other words, there are booms and busts in intellectual development. Mm-hmm. So Keynes, for instance, had a tremendous boom. The Keynesians did not have actually the subtlety of mind of Keynes. Mm-hmm. Just as Marxists didn't quite have, Marxist intelligence either.
Who could? Yes.
So Keynesianism got a little bit overdone, and basically Keynes proposed his theory at a time of depression, when the lack of demand was the problem, and therefore his prescription involved public spending. And he did not propose anything much in the way of arresting inflation. Had he lived in the 70s, I'm confident he would have recognized the problem of inflation. It was inherent in his general theory that equilibrium will not give you the optimum, that there are less than optimum arrangements that can prevail. He called them equilibria. And of course, even today, we talk about multiple equilibria, which to my mind means that sometimes you're in disequilibrium. I call it disequilibrium. So I think he would have dealt with inflation, but because he didn't, monetarism came back into vogue. Milton Friedman was tremendously influential, and actually that was a revival of the monetarist theory that prevailed in the 1920s, which then led to the Great Crash.
Was discredited by it.
So there has been a little bit of a repetition in history.
Well, in just the way the late 70s discredited, to some extent, Keynes.
Right, right.
Thank you very much. My name is Cecilia Björner, and I'm the Swedish ambassador here in Hungary. I think that my country is possibly a good example of where you have parted the market sphere and the political sphere, as you call it. And I would personally argue that that's one of the reasons why we have been relatively prosperous over a long period of time. However, we see almost the opposite trend in Sweden from your suggestion, and that is that we are having more market influence in the political sphere and in some parts more political influence in the market sphere. So my question to you would be, how do you ensure an efficient use of resources in the political sphere if you don't have market principles or market ideas guiding the use of public funds? And the other side is, how do you make sure that the market side or the capitalistic side is taking responsibility for public common interests and goods if you do not have political influence in the sphere? And I'm thinking about the environment and the climate, of course.
A very big question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm reminded we have 4 minutes left, so if you can begin to answer that in 4.
Please don't misunderstand me in being in any way opposed to markets. I think markets are really a wonderful instrument for allowing adjustments, allowing feedback in particular, very important, that is neglected. Actually, I argued in my lecture for the minimum intervention from government in the form of regulation and intervention in the economy. One should give whatever the markets can do, should be allowed to do it because they do it much, much better than governments can.
Then you would do less than the Swedes do, presumably.
Well, I don't want to go into the Swedish situation because I don't know it well enough. But it's very. Markets have a role, but there's also a need for political decisions, and markets are not designed to make those social choices. Markets are for exchange among market participants, and there are social needs and public goods and so on, which need to be provided by a political process. And generally, as I argued in my lecture, markets are actually more efficient than the political process. Therefore, we should leave it to them what they can do. But to claim that they can do everything, just because they are more efficient, is an exaggeration that has cost us very dearly.
Does anyone have a one-sentence question? We have 2 minutes left. I need your commitment to one sentence. Yes, sir. You get the prize.
Julius Horvat, Central European University. Can you comment on the relationship of market fundamentalism and the fall of communism? Because there...
The relationship between market fundamentalism and the fall of communism.
Yeah, good.
That's one Well, you know, the fall of the disintegration of the Soviet Empire could be interpreted either as the triumph of capitalism or the triumph of open society. And there were these two approaches. And actually, I took it to be the victory of open society over closed society. Others, like Václav Klaus, saw it as the victory of capitalism over, of course, I would argue my case.
This is certainly the most global audience that we have had in the 4 lectures to date, and I want to particularly thank our participants from Fudan University. It's also been, I think, in many ways, our most thought-provoking and debate-provoking lecture by our distinguished lecturer, and we are extremely grateful for that. Tomorrow, in his final lecture, Mr. Soros will bring together all the themes that he has been exploring with us this week, and he will show the way forward from our current enormous set of dilemmas, crises, and problems in many dimensions. So this will be an extraordinary moment for us when we return to this hall tomorrow. I'm very grateful to our moderator, Mark Danner, and once again, I invite you to join me in thanking George Soros for inspiring and provoking us with his thought and his thoughtfulness. Thank you.